Welcome back, everybody. In this lesson, we are going to create a modal dialog using our toggle component that we refactored in the last lesson. You may have noticed on our WaffleBox application, there's been this very lonely grayed out subscribe button that doesn't do anything. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and wire it up. So when you click on the subscribe button, it's going to launch some sort of modal where we could like pay for the WaffleBox service, enter our credit card information or whatever you want. And by clicking on the button, the modal, when we say modal, that's generally a component where you have sort of a dialog that covers up other content on the page. And it's almost like a pop-up, but it's actually in the context of the page itself. So it's sort of like a toggle where we're toggling the display of something, but modals have a lot of unique elements to them that you want to consider when you're implementing them. So it's kind of similar to our drop-downs where we're toggling the display of something that it's overlaying the content, but it's going to be really different in its implementation. And that's going to be what we focus on in this lesson. So let's dive right in. The first thing I want to do is our subscribe button is currently disabled. You'll notice in index.html, we have this comment that says purchase modal. It already has a container around it, div class equals modal, and you can see there's a button in here. We actually don't need that ID equals subscribe, and we don't need disabled on that. And you'll see just by doing that, we have just a button that doesn't do anything. A big green button, and we can now wire this up to basically display some sort of modal dialog content. That HTML doesn't exist yet. So the first thing that I want to do is let's go ahead and create some sample content and some sample HTML for our modal. And generally with a modal dialog, what I would do is kind of have the HTML set up in a certain way, because if you've used modal dialogs in any other UI framework like Bootstrap, Bulma, etc., I'll just show you an example of one. Let's go to Bulma. If we go to the documentation, components, modal, launch example modal, you'll see this is kind of what we want to go for. We have this idea of kind of graying out the background, so you have sort of a layer that is full screen. It shows up over top of all the content and sort of dims it out, so it keeps your focus on this dialogue itself, this sort of mini document within here that is inside of our page. And we want to do the same thing. We want to have sort of a layer that covers up the whole page back here, but also a layer that is our white background and sort of our dialogue itself that appears in the middle. And we're going to work in a close button at some point, just like they've done inside of Bulma. So that's what we want to do here. So in our HTML, we can set that up. We can do a div with an ID of subscribe and a class of modal overlay is usually how I would do that. So you have what's called an overlay, that's what I would call the dark box that appears over top of everything. And then inside of the overlay, you have the dialog itself. So that's going to be a div with a class of modal dialog. And then within the dialog, usually the way I set it up is I would consider each modal dialog like its own little document. So just like a normal web page or a web document, you would have a header, a body, and a footer. So we could have, for example, header with a class of modal dialog title, right? So we kind of have a title area, and this could be, H3 complete your purchase or whatever. And then we could have a div with a class of modal dialog body. So that can be the center of the dialog. And we can have a paragraph that says something like, get ready to order some awesome possum waffles. Just fill out this ridiculously long form and we'll totally not share your personal information with our large network of partners. Sorry, I probably could have shortened that for your sake. we wrote it all out, didn't we? But anyway, so you could put in whatever content you want here. You can do anything you want. You can put in a form if you want. Just put in some dummy content so that we have something that we can play with whenever we're testing this out. And then finally, let's put in a footer with a class of modal dialog. I usually call these the actions because normally in a dialog, and this could be optional, like maybe not every modal has a footer, but we'll go ahead and add that here. Maybe there's like a buy now button or a complete purchase or a cancel button or whatever. Any actions that you want for that modal could go down here. So you could have like button.light we'll say cancel, and then we can have button.info will be buy now or whatever. So when I save this, you'll see it's just going to show up as normal content right now, right? We have this H3, we have the paragraph, and we have our buttons right here. So there's nothing special about this at this point. It's just HTML content. But what we'll actually want to do is this has an ID of subscribe. Just like all of our other toggles, we're going to do something like data-modal equals subscribe. And so that's going to do a selector to this element down here. And then we can basically hide modal overlays when they're not active, when we have a toggle that's not active on there. So that will be, we'll have to create a new Sass file over here because that's going to be in our CSS. So we'll create modals, I guess. I'm using plural in most of my Sass file names. I'm never sure whether to use plural or singular. But anyway, we will import, maybe after our dropdowns, import modals like so. And we'll say modal dialogs, and we'll say modal overlay, not active, display none. So we'll do our whole toggle thing. We haven't instantiated a toggle yet. So in order to get that to show up, we'll have to go into app.js. We'll create a modals instance, const modals equal new toggle. And then the attribute will be data-modal. And the toggle container will of course be .modal, which was that surrounding container. And let's go ahead and save that. And you'll see now by clicking on subscribe, we have the toggle functionality working just fine. So obviously the CSS is not what we want here. We want the presentation to be very, very different from what it is now. So what we'll do in order to get this more modal-like is we will go into our modals.sass file that we created here, and let's make some additions to this to make sure that this is going to appear very much like a modal. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. I'll say that first of all, is that there's, whenever people do modals, some people do like position fixed. So no matter if you scroll up or down, the modal will still be on top. Some people do position absolute because they don't want to affect the scrolling and have two layers of scrolling, which gets weird sometimes. Some people disable scrolling on the body altogether, and they actually have any scrolling overflow within the modal itself, so that the modal dialog actually scrolls up and down. But that's kind of the main factor when you're doing the CSS for your modals, is how are you going to handle overflow? So like if I have a really big modal and I'm on a little tiny screen, if the content can't fit like just in this little box right here, how am I going to deal with the overflow when it goes way down? And you'll notice in the case of Bulma, if we just come in here and we duplicate this content like 50 times or whatever, I'm just going to paste it in a whole bunch. We'll try to get enough to make it scroll. You'll see what happens when you have too much content is I'm actually scrolling inside of the modal dialog itself. I can't scroll on the body. I'm actually scrolling here inside of the modal. And that's something you have to consider, especially for responsive screens. Modals are a challenge because what if you have too much content to display? You can't just necessarily stick a modal dialog on the page and just expect it to always be fully visible. You have to consider this overflow experience. And that's one of the biggest challenges with modals. And it's one of the reasons that makes it a little more advanced in its implementation is if you do it right, you want to make sure that the user experience, especially on touch screens, is really good. Because one of the problems you can run into is, you can set the overflow inside the dialog, but if you still have overflow behind it, then you actually have two layers that are scrollable. And that usually works fine on a desktop because it's always going to scroll where your cursor is. So if I go up and down over here, it's going to scroll. If I go up and down here, it's going to scroll. But on a touch screen, when you scroll up and down, the layering is not always, it's not always clear. It doesn't always work well. Like in iOS, you can if you have a dialog like that and you try to scroll up and down, sometimes it won't scroll, and it's very frustrating because there can be multiple layers. So we're going to deal with all that stuff. I just wanted to show that to you guys and introduce that as like the issue, first of all, because it is something you need to consider. And that's the main difference between a lot of the different modals that are out there, is they basically are dealing with their overflow in different ways. But I'm going to show you what I think is a good pattern to deal with that and as we implement this into our modal overlay class here. So first of all, what I prefer to do is position fixed. So we're going to set position fixed, which will make it so even if we were to scroll up and down, this is always going to stay in the same place. And I basically do like top 0, left 0, right 0, bottom 0. Right? And so what that's going to do is very simply, you'll notice it appears on the top of the page here. There's my content. If I scroll down, it stays fixed to the window. So that's what position fixed is going to do. And right now, if we inspect this, our modal itself, or our modal overlay, you'll see is filling the whole size of our screen here. And so if we want to kind of get that grayed out effect, we could set a background color. So the background could be transparentized darkest 0.5 maybe 0.3, a little darker. There we go. So we kind of darkened out the back of the page there, if you will. And then we can have a modal dialog, which will be background lightest. And so the dialog itself will actually have a lot of contrast with a dark background. And in order to get this in the center of the page, which is kind of what we want, sort of like this, we can use Flexbox to do that pretty easily. So we can do display flex on this guy, display flex, and that's going to make it fill that size by default, but we can set a couple things like justify content center and align items. I think those are the two we would want to do. Yeah, so you'll see now it kind of shows up in the center. And now if we set a width on this to be something like 500 pixels or something, you'll see it's going to show up in the center. But I don't want to hard code that at 500 because obviously at these smaller sizes, that isn't going to work. So we'll probably put that inside of a media query, media min width, screen medium. And then we'll move the width into there. So that way, by default, you'll be full width. So when we go down to small screens, it's going to take up the full width and just take up however much space it can. But if we go up to larger screen, it'll fix it at 500 and it'll sort of stay aligned in the center. And the cool thing about Flexbox is if my content size changes, so if we like duplicate our paragraph a couple times in here, you'll see it just fills out from the center, which is great. But again, you got to worry about the overflow, right? So that it's all about the overflow with modals. So if we paste that a few more times, you'll notice, ooh, big issue, right? Because it's Flexbox, so it's filling out from the center in a position fixed container, which means that we have content that is now clipped and it is not accessible. We cannot see our content when it grows too large. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to, on our modal dialog, set a max height of 100 VH, which will be the vertical height of our window. And if we apply that, you'll notice here that, so it did set a max height so we can see our content, but we also need to set overflow-y as auto. So you'll see when we have overflow, we can now actually scroll inside of the dialog. So you need to consider that overflow. That's, again, the biggest thing with modals. You need to make sure that overflow works out really well. And if I refresh, you'll see I still get, if there is no overflow, it'll just stick to the center of the window. So that's definitely what we want in this case. Another thing I'll generally do, again, just kind of looking at the overflow issues of this. So we have our overflow content here. And if you go down to a really small screen, that's like, it pretty much takes over the whole page, right? So I want there at least to be some semblance of, hey, this is a modal dialog. It's on top of other content. I think that's important. So I'll generally add some padding to this fixed position thing. So like padding 15 pixels or something. And you'll see that's gonna fix on the left and the right. But because our max height on the modal dialog itself is 100 VH, it will take up 100% of the vertical height of our window. So we can actually change this to be a calc value, so 100 VH minus, and then we'll basically take the top and the bottom padding, so that'll be 30 pixels together. So that way, the max height can only go up to leaving 15 pixels on all sides. And then now we can still scroll up and down when it gets too wide. And it's still going to kind of allow us to scroll up and down here, but it's still going to at least leave a little bit of padding around the edge so we can always see that, hey, this is a dialog that's appearing on top of other stuff. And just in case of z-index issues, definitely a good idea to add a really big z-index of like 100 or whatever, 1,000. It depends on your application. But add a big number onto the Z index just in case you have other fixed position things. You want to make sure that your modal dialogues are always going to appear on top. Let's give this also a border radius on the dialog itself. Border radius will be radius. We have a radius variable, so that'll kind of round it off. We need some padding on this as well. So let's add padding 15 pixels. And then maybe when you get to a larger size, so you see that add some padding to the dialog, we'll double that to 30 pixels, like so. So a small size, it's going to look like this, nice and compact. At a larger size, you get a little more breathing room around the outside there. That's looking pretty good at this point. And if we refresh to go back to a small dialog, you'll see that's starting to look pretty darn good. And so let's go down to the small size and try it as well, just to make sure everything's appearing very nice at this point. Just like with our dropdowns, if you remember, we created utility classes to allow us to change the sizes of them. I think that's a good idea as well with our modal dialog. So we are fixing the width at 500 pixels. We could create some additional sizes as well. So maybe we have a small size that's going to be width 300 pixels and a large size. It'll be width, I don't know, like 600. Or something like that. And then that way, you simply come in and you say modal dialog. It's actually this one up here, large, for example. So when we turn this on, you see it's going to take up a little more room, or I could do small. And it's going to be a little tiny dialog like that. So that's going to allow you to have a little more control over the size of your dialogues. I think that's generally going to be a good idea. And I like the buttons on the footer down here to be right aligned for whatever reason. I don't know if there's research that shows that's actually a good thing or not. That's just what I aesthetically prefer. So we'll take this modal dialog actions, and in our SAS file, we'll do modal dialog actions, display flex, justify content, flex end. Whoops, end. Here we go. So we have our buttons over to the right there. And then we'll say when you have anything next to each other inside of here, so a direct child plus child. So when you have two things next to each other, we can do a margin left, I don't know, like 8 pixels or something. There we go, just to give a little spacing between those. So that way you can add as many buttons as you want into the actions row, but it'll always be sort of right aligned, which I think is looking pretty good. Okay, so let's talk about the overflow. So again, this is something that even though we've kind of dealt with this, we added overflow so that if your dialog body has a ton of content in it, so if we were to come in here and yet again duplicate our paragraph like 30 times or something ridiculous, you get this nice overflow container, and that looks pretty good. But the problem is right now we have two elements that are scrolling, and the issue you're going to run into, and it's hard to duplicate on the browser here because it just works when you're in the Chrome desktop browser. But notice how if I kind of grab on the very edge, I'm actually scrolling in the background. You'll notice, especially on iOS, and I don't know about Android if it does this as much, but even if I were to take my finger and grab right here and scroll like this, right? Even if I were to do that, sometimes on iOS, it will actually say, oh, the background is scrolling. We're going to scroll the background instead. And that can be very frustrating because you're just trying to scroll down inside the dialog to get to the button or something. And yeah, it's kind of like this. Notice how even though my finger is here, when I pull down, it's actually scrolling the background. That will be actually what happens quite a bit in iOS, even when you're not at the very edge of something. And that can be incredibly frustrating. So what we can actually do to fix this on a modal dialog is basically whenever the modal dialog is open, we remove the overflow from the body so that it cannot scroll up and down. That's the easiest thing to do in order to fix this. So let me show you how we would do that in this case, and just to kind of improve this a little bit. So I think the easiest thing to do would be in our app.js, let's add an onToggle event. And you'll see the nice IntelliSense we get now that we added our JS doc stuff. Button target is toggled, which looks great. So we'll say button target is toggled. And then let's take that data, those arguments or parameters that we receive from the onToggle method. And basically what we can do is we can kind of toggle a class on the body of our document based on whether or not a modal is currently open. So we could say document.body.classList, and we could say, is it currently toggled? If so, let's add this class. Otherwise, remove it. And we're going to remove the hasModal class. So basically, whenever the toggle is toggled, we're going to add hasModal to the body. And whenever it's not toggled, we're going to remove hasModal from the body. So these are just CSS classes. So it's not going to do anything just yet, but you'll notice if I look at the body, you see how it has a class of app container. When I click on subscribe, it gets hasModal. When I hit enter on my keyboard, it goes away, right? So it's actually toggling hasModal on and off. And what's cool about that is now in our Sass file, come down here and say disable body scroll. Body, we can just do .hasModal overflow hidden. And so whenever the modal is open, I cannot, well, actually I can scroll up and down. I don't know why I can. It shouldn't be able to. Let's test it here in this touch screen. So yeah, you'll see now if I scroll up and down right here, it's actually locked, like in the touch view. I cannot scroll up and down in the background, but what's nice is if we have a bunch of overflow content inside of here, like so, I can scroll up and down here, but it's kind of locked to just the modal scrolling up and down. You see, even if I grab over on the edge, I cannot scroll up and down in the background until I were to dismiss the modal, which will be, right now there's no way to do it other than to change your keyboard focus to the subscribe button and hit enter. But you'll see here, now that I dismiss that and we go here, now I can scroll again, right? So it's basically kind of scroll locking or overflow locking, if you will, and that can be really, really helpful in a modal. So the only thing you're going to run into with this is that whenever you have content here, you can see I get a scroll bar. As soon as I open the modal, watch the subscribe button up here. See how it moved over? So it's actually moving left and right, and that's because this scroll bar is appearing and disappearing. In most operating systems, the scroll bar is 15 pixels wide, so we could simply set padding right 15 pixels whenever it has modal. And you'll see now, when I go back and forth, the subscribe button doesn't actually move left and right. Everything's staying in the same place because you'll see I kind of have a 15 pixel padding on the right there. That's totally optional. You don't necessarily need to do that. And it's not always going to be the case. Like if you have a page that doesn't scroll, this will actually cause it to go back and forth. So you may have to do something fancy to check, or set a min height on your document so you always have a scroll bar, or do a CSS scroll bar. All kinds of stuff you could do there. But that's just a little trick. They actually do that. I think they do that in Bootstrap. So I just kind of want to bring that up because it is a little trick you can do. All right, so another thing I want to make sure we do here is we make this blurrable, because generally I would expect when a modal is open, I want to click off of the modal to dismiss it. So we could try to enable the blur here. So if I come in and I say blur true, let's test this out. If I click subscribe and I click away, it's not actually going to do anything. And the reason is if I look at what I'm clicking on over here, I'm actually clicking on Modal Overlay, right? Because we have this dark background that's being overlaid on top of all the content behind the scenes. And that way, that means that when we do a blur click, so it's checking to see, did you click on, what target did you click on? Oh, you clicked on a Modal Overlay. Is that inside of a modal? Yes, then it's not a blur click. And that's the issue in this case, is that because our Modal Overlay is capturing our blur clicks, and not allowing them to blur does not actually work on the modal because the whole screen is filled up and there's no way to click away from the modal itself. So what we can actually do to fix this is actually a CSS trick, if you will. There's a special thing you can add to an HTML element in your CSS, and it's called pointer events. And there's lots of different things for this. Lots of different values, but it basically defines which mouse events are allowed to occur on that particular element. And if you actually set it to none, it basically is like that element doesn't exist. So you can see, even though I can click there's an element on top of this text, I can still select that text like I normally would be able to because I set pointer events to none. And then now, because pointer events is set to none, I can actually, when I click here, I'm actually clicking on that image in the background. It's almost, you can pretend like your mouse cursor is going right through that element that has pointer events none. It just totally ignores that element. I can still click on these links up here to toggle things on and off. It's like that element doesn't exist. But the problem is now all the children of that modal overlay, which include this down here, these are not capturing clicks as well, right? So we want our dialogue to be clickable. I want to be able to click this text or this buy now, but if I click there, it's doing a blur click because now we've turned off all mouse events for the whole modal. So we need to turn the pointer events back on in our modal dialog. So down here, we'll do pointer events all. So we'll turn them all back on. And then now we can actually select, we can click on these buttons and we can click away to dismiss. So that's just a little trick, is you can disable pointer events on the overlay itself, and then that will allow you to sort of click through. The only disadvantage of that is is it a little weird that I can like hover over this in the background? Like maybe, and if that's the case, all you would have to do is like basically inside of your overlay, create like another div that's like div.modal shadow or something, and then just have it be a separate element from the dialog. And then that way you could set up like a blur click, like you would have to create a new click handler or something where you could dismiss when clicking on modal shadow. But that's another method to do that. I kind of prefer the pointer events none because it makes the HTML simpler and you don't have to do extra JavaScript to wire it up and stuff. But there are other methods, so you can totally do those other things as well if you want to. But this will be how we do this in this case. We'll set pointer events to none. We now have a blurrable modal. It's probably also a good idea to set single to true. I don't know if there's a case where you'd have another modal pop up. That'd be kind of weird. But we can dismiss them just in case, like maybe somebody's using their keyboard to tab through stuff and then they open another modal somewhere. We want to close this one in that very specific use case. All right, so at this point, I think we have a really good basic modal dialog that has blur enabled. In the next lesson, we're going to look at improving this a little bit more by adding some dismiss functionality to our toggle script. Right now, you can't sort of dismiss the dialog by clicking on cancel or clicking on X, and it's going to be a big issue if you add like another toggle button inside of here. So if I were to add like, for example, button dot. All right, let's just add a button and then we'll add close dialog. But if we were to do the same thing where we did like data modal equals subscribe on this button to sort of create a dismiss, you'll see it's an issue because now when I click on close dialog, what happened is I closed the dialog, but on this success button or this subscribe button down here, RE expanded is still true. So now when I click on this one, RE expanded goes to true again. And you kind of get into this weird scenario where like your RE expandeds get off, and sometimes you could even have to like click on something twice to get it to close, which it just gets weird. So it gets a little buggy, even though it actually appears to work pretty good right now. It definitely is not going to work in all scenarios. And for accessibility purposes, you want your RE expanded things to always be up to date. So this actually, that's an issue right there. So once you add two of these, now if I blur click, so if I click away, it actually just activated the dialog because technically one of our buttons was still active. So it was trying to blur on a button that technically was actually activating its target instead of deactivating it. So just an example of how weird things get once you start to add multiple buttons that are pointing to the same target. So this is not going to be a good way to handle this. So in the next lesson, we'll kind of look at how we can introduce this idea of a dismiss click into our toggle components that are going to augment the way that we can sort of dismiss things like these modal dialogs that you see here. So stay tuned. We'll check that out in just a few moments.